Center for Latin American Studies, and our partner for this series of conferences, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this symposium on a rather frightening topic, poverty. Poverty is a prominent reality in Latin America's landscape. According to some recent data, more than half and even up to 2/3 of Latin America's population live below the poverty line. Social scientists have come forward to point out that poverty is a far more complex phenomena which cannot be solely explained by pure economic criteria. Accordingly, in recent years, academia and international entities have designed indicators which involve factors such as access to justice, access to education, freedom of expression, etc. What this dynamic means to the understanding of poverty in Latin America and other regions as well is central to our discussion this afternoon. We have brought together a very distinguished team of experts. Their bios were distributed earlier. Mauricio Rodas, president of the Ethos Foundation of Mexico, will present the poverty indices his organization has been able to develop. Ethos is a very serious Mexican think tank and highly respected, and over the years we have developed a fruitful collaboration with Mauricio and his organization. John Hammock, I'm pleased to disclose, is a leading political scientist and an old friend of mine. He teaches public policy at the Fletcher School, Tufts University, which I attended almost half a century ago. On a more serious note, John has worked with outstanding institutions in the quest against poverty in today's world, and he will speak about the new indices and his personal experience in the trenches of this contemporary battle. Andrew Natsios, who will be here momentarily, whom I had the good fortune of meeting during my ambassadorial years, has been at the forefront in the global struggle against poverty. He was the chief administrator of AID, among other positions, and today is a senior fellow at Hudson and a professor at Georgetown University. He will provide closing remarks, after which we will have a period of questions and answers. We wish to recognize the Lynn and Harry Bradley Foundation for their generosity in making possible this series of conferences. And without any further ado, I invite Mauricio to the podium.
Good morning to you all. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here with you, and it's really an honor to share this panel with such distinguished experts like Professor Hammock and Ambassador Darrenblum. Today, I will talk about the Ethos Poverty Index, which is, like Ambassador Darrenblum said, an effort of Fundación Ethos, the institution that I run, which is a think tank based in Mexico City, an effort to contribute with a different vision to understand and measure poverty in Latin America. Let's begin. Like Ambassador Darrenblum said, poverty has been measured in different ways, mainly focusing in insufficient income or lack of access to education, health, housing, and other basic services throughout the years. In most of these measurements, Latin America has been improving during the last decade, which obviously is very positive. However, there are ongoing debates regarding how to best measure poverty based on different definitions of this phenomenon. And this is actually what we are doing through the Ethos Poverty Index, to try to come up with a different approach to measure poverty in a much broader and comprehensive way, not only thinking poverty as an economic phenomenon, but rather as something much more humane. And thus, the ethos poverty index perspective is precisely that poverty is not just a situation of insufficient income, but rather a lack of liberties, rights, and capabilities. As most of you would identify, this approach follows that of Professor Amartya Sen and other experts in the world with ideas that has been pushed forth lately, thinking of poverty as a much broader, much comprehensive problem. Now, following this definition, we can picture poverty, for example, in a country because people don't have access to adequate income, don't have access to education and health, but also a country in which people don't have access to freedom of speech because they have fear of some kind of threat because of their expressing their ideas, or people that cannot leave their homes because of the threat of crime, or women in a society that cannot have access to better salary conditions just because they are women. All those issues also represent a reality of poverty under this kind of perspective. Now, in order to apply this vision in an index, we divided the ethos poverty index into two components. The first component, which you have to the left-hand side of the slide, is what we call household poverty. In this case, the measurement unit is the household, and it includes variables that have traditionally been considered in poverty measures, like income, per capita household income, education level of household head, school attendance of children aged between 7 and 15 years, potable water and sanitation services, housing conditions, cooking fuel, and electricity. Once again, all these variables comprises what we call household poverty, in which the measurement unit is the household and are the variables that have been traditionally considered in poverty measures. Now, the second component of the ethos poverty index is what we have to the right-hand side of the slide, and it's what we call contextual poverty. And this is probably the most innovative aspect of the ethos poverty index. In this case, the poverty, the measurement unit is the country. That is, we use aggregate data at the country level, and we have here 7 different dimensions, like public health, institutions, including aspects regarding government effectiveness, corruption control, the fight against corruption, political stability, economy with unemployment rate, economic competitiveness, microfinance access, democracy with civil liberties, including freedom of speech, political rights, political culture, public safety, which has a very close relationship with poverty, homicide rate, vehicle theft rate, trust in the police, issues regarding gender, and issues regarding the environment. Now, the reason why we included all these variables is because of the relation with poverty, because we think that these variables comprises the vision of poverty that we have, and also because of a statistical correlation. Those were the criteria to determine which variables to select in this exercise. Now, once again, here we have the contextual poverty component with country data, with data aggregated at the country level. These are the two components of the ethos poverty index. We included 8 countries of Latin America for this index, which combined almost 80% of the region's population. The reason why we chose these countries is because of data availability and also data reliability, because there were some countries in which there wasn't enough data in order to have figures for all the variables that were included in the index. Now let's look at the results of the first component of the ethos poverty index, which is the household component. Here we can identify 3 groups of countries. First one, comprised by Bolivia, which has a very high score, being the country with the worst results regarding household poverty. Then we have a second group of countries, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, and Venezuela, that have an above 0.1 score that would be like in the middle range of the set of countries analyzed. And then we have a third group of countries comprised by Brazil, Mexico, and Chile that have the best results on this set of countries. This household poverty ranking includes the variables that were traditionally considered in poverty measures. Now, let's look at what happens if we consider those innovative variables in a poverty measure, the ones considered in the contextual poverty component. It's really interesting to see how things change here. Bolivia is still the country with the worst results. Ecuador also keeps the 7th position, but Venezuela went down to the 6th position. Venezuela was 4th in the household poverty ranking. Now it's 6th. Peru remained in the 5th position. Colombia climbed 2 positions because it had the 6th position in the household poverty ranking. Now it has the 4th one here in the contextual one. Brazil climbs to the 2nd position. It held the 3rd one in the household poverty ranking, and Chile remains in the 1st one. Now let's see the general ranking. The ethos poverty index, it's the average of the household poverty and contextual poverty components. And here we can see the effect of including variables of contextual poverty in the overall results. Chile remains as 1st one. Brazil, as I said before, climbed to the 2nd position. It had the 3rd one in household poverty. The opposite was true with Mexico. Mexico held the 2nd position in contextual poverty, but as a result of having the 3rd one in the household poverty, it went down to the 3rd one also in the ethos poverty index. Colombia has the 4th position in the ethos poverty index as a result of its good score in the contextual poverty ranking. The opposite happened with Venezuela, and this is really interesting. Venezuela has the 4th position in the household poverty ranking, but it has very, very poor results regarding contextual poverty, and that's why it went down to the 6th position in the overall average in the ethos poverty index. Ecuador has the 7th position in all of the components, and also Bolivia with the 8th position. So this is our ranking. Now, let's take a look of certain particular characteristics of each country on these variables. And let's see specifically what most affects household poverty in the countries analyzed. In the case of Bolivia, the most pressing problem concerns income. This variable contributes more than any other to its household poverty figures. In the case of Brazil, it is the number of uneducated household heads, followed by the lack of sanitation services, the most pressing problems. Chile has work still remain to be done regarding access to sanitation services and potable water. They account for 24 and 23% of the overall household poverty data. In the case of Colombia, it is income, something that is representing a very serious problem. It accounts for almost half of the percentage of its household poverty. In the case of Ecuador, it is potable water and income, the most pressing issues. Mexico has income also as a big problem, followed by sanitation services and access to potable water. Peru has its biggest challenge with potable water, which far exceeds any other. And Venezuela has also income issues. Income continues to be a seriously lagging factor in spite of all the money this country has been receiving because of high oil prices. Now let's see what affects most contextual poverty in each of the countries analyzed. In the case of Bolivia, it is public health, institutions, and to a lesser extent, democracy and economy what represent the biggest challenges. In the case of Ecuador, it is also institutions, democracy, and economy. And interestingly enough, in Venezuela, is also the fragility of democracy, institutions, and economy, together with insecurity, what represent the biggest challenges. It is really interesting to identify how these countries that are governed by regimes that are following what they call the socialism of the 21st century have actually the same kind of problems. The fragility of institutions, the fragility of the democratic system, and the lack of an economic growth that could steer progress in their nations. In the case of Peru, it is public health and institutions, affecting actually both with 27% to the total contextual poverty figures. In the case of Colombia, it is public health, institution, democracy, although democracy contributes to poverty figures twice as much as institution and public health put together. In the case of Chile, interestingly enough, they have issues regarding gender equality in spite of having a woman as president, but they still have a long path to go in order to achieve gender equality. They also have issues regarding public safety and economic concerns, particularly regarding unemployment. Unemployment figures in Chile are high. Brazil has public health as the main problem. It accounts for more than all the dimensions put together. And finally, Mexico needs to fundamentally address security as well as strengthen the democratic and institution environment in order to improve their contextual poverty numbers. Let's talk about the conclusions of this work. It is really interesting to see the effect of including contextual poverty variables into this analysis. By doing that, the ranking of Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela changed if only considered the traditional variables, the ones comprising household poverty component. So it is interesting to see what happened once we include all those variables with these countries' poverty figures. Despite the fact that the governments from Bolivia, Venezuela, and Ecuador have outspokenly defined poverty alleviation as their main cause, as their flagship, they are actually the least effective in this regard, in poverty reduction, once we look at poverty from a much more broad, from a comprehensive perspective. These are the least effective countries regarding poverty reduction. The poverty gap in Latin America is significant, which is confirmed by the difference in scores between Chile and Bolivia. Chile having the first position, Bolivia having the last. Obviously, that's something to be worried about. But on the other hand, it shows that it is possible to reduce poverty in Latin America. Chile is an example of how a country can do things well and they can actually alleviate poverty, which it doesn't mean that they don't have problems. We are seeing now how Chile is facing problems, for example, regarding education. But overall, we can argue that they are following the right path. Raising income and access to potable water would mostly improve household poverty in the countries analyzed. In the case of contextual poverty, we can argue that countries with weak institutional environment are also the poorest. We found a direct correlation between weak institutions and poverty in the countries analyzed. Economic factors do have a significant impact, but it is not an absolute one regarding poverty. And this is demonstrated by the fact that, for example, Bolivia, in spite of having a relatively low unemployment rate, or at least that's what the official Bolivian figures are telling, they are having the worst position in the poverty ranking. Whereas Chile, which has a relatively high unemployment rate also, reported by the local authorities, they are still having the #1 position in the general ranking. That is, economic factors do have a significant impact, but it is not an absolute one once we look at poverty in a more comprehensive way. A strong social policy is key. This is a fundamental aspect of poverty alleviation, but it is not enough to achieve this goal. You can put a lot of money into the social area, like countries such as Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador has been doing, and that is really important. You have to do that. That's really positive. But you have to couple that first with quality spending, because it's not just a matter of quantity, but also quality. You have to invest your money with savvy in order to not only raise the offer of public social services, but also the quality of them. But even doing that, that won't be enough to alleviate poverty, because you also have to have strong, responsible policies in the economic area, in the institutional area, regarding the respect of liberties, the respect of democracy. And that's something that is not happening in some of the countries analyzed, as we have argued. There is a new, to call it some way, kind of poverty that we call contextual poverty, the study of which should be deepened and integrated into analysis and poverty measurements with academicus and methodological rigor. And probably this is the most interesting finding of this work, and is that successfully alleviating poverty is not a matter of right or left-wing trends, but rather responsible government criteria. If you look at the general ranking, you can see how Chile, that is a country that was governed during 2 decades by socialist regimes, by the left, is having the #1 position. Brazil, who has been governed for 9 years now by the left, is having the #2 position. But it is also a group of countries governed by the left, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia, the ones having the worst positions in the ranking. That is, you can have good results, you can reduce poverty effectively being on the left, but also you can have very bad results being on the left or on the right. What really characterizes the success cases, the success stories, it is not being on the left or the right, as this ranking shows. What really characterizes success stories is following what we at Fundación Ethos call the responsible government model. That is a set of criteria for the design and implementation of public policies, including the respect for democracy, the respect for freedom, for human rights, for the constitutional framework, for the legal system, as well as designing a technically sound social, economic policy that would steer competitiveness, policy that would attack effectively insecurity and other issues. That for us is the way to go, as the results show, to apply a group of policies that regardless of right or left-wing trends, would put people as their main priority and would be the opposite as populist trends that unfortunately has been growing in the region in the last few years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mauricio.
I want to first thank my friend Jaime, Ambassador Dr. Jaime Darrenblum, for the invitation to speak today at the Hudson Institute on the topic of poverty and politics in Latin America. I've had the privilege of living in Latin America for most of my life, and actually working on the issue of poverty. I happened to be born and raised in Cuba, and then had spent 2.5 years working in Costa Rica, and I've lived in a number of other countries. Latin America as a region now is not considered by most experts to be poor. Almost all the countries in Latin America are now what development experts call middle-income countries. But go to the slums of any Latin American country, go to the rural areas of any Latin American country and tell them that they're not poor. Poverty is gripping in almost all of Latin America. I was just in the Dominican Republic, for example, and talked to the people of the slums of Santiago or in the rural areas just outside Santiago, and the poverty there is fairly devastating. Latin America per capita income marks glaring disparities in inequality within society. And most Latin American governments realize that relying exclusively on the market, while it can help drive GDP and growth, does not deal with this inequality or acute poverty. Governments of all political stripes, and I mean all political stripes, are focused on how to deal with these issues. Today I want to focus not on the politics of the market or on the political approach, but rather to a new approach to deal with poverty. An approach that can impact poverty regardless of the political system that's in power. As I begin, allow me to ask you a question to think with me for 30 seconds. If I had to ask you, what do you think makes up poverty? What are the components of poverty in Latin America? What would you think? And second, if you were to go to an impoverished community in Latin America and ask residents how would they define the elements of their poverty, what would they say? I guarantee you that whether you're in Venezuela, Chile, Colombia, or any other country of Latin America, you're going to come up with an earful. You're going to come up with a number of things. Clearly, people are impoverished where they do not have enough income. There's no doubt about that. But ask any poor person what matters most to them they will say income, but they will then also say a number of other things, such as health, education, access to basic services, water, electricity, etc. How we define poverty is crucial because it defines how we measure and then deal with poverty. And how is poverty now measured in Latin America? How is poverty measured here in the United States? It's measured by income. Primarily, there's an income line. You're either above or below that income line. And the benefits that flow to the poor are based on whether you're up or down in that income line. That's the basic measure of poverty used worldwide. Of course, the absolute income may change from the United States to El Salvador, but it's the same basic idea of an income line. Policymakers who confront poverty realize that that is an important marker, but it's not enough. Because poverty, they realize, is made up of these other components that have to be dealt with. So why do we measure poverty just by income? Income was considered and is still a good proxy for poverty. But it has been and will continue to be useful. There's no doubt about that. But it's a unidimensional measure, which doesn't take in the breadth of what poverty is in Latin America or any place else. And governments have realized that it's not enough to deal with just income. I've been privileged to be part of an effort at Oxford called the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, which has developed a new multidimensional measure of poverty. And that's a mouthful, but what it is a measure of poverty that deals with a lot of dimensions of poverty at the same time, in a rigorous, academically solid and sound way, in a way that will convince governments that they can implement it. The Alkire-Foster measure, which is its name, was developed in Oxford and basically takes a country to, let me just very quickly tell you what the method is, and then I'll move on to what I want to talk about, which is more why it's important. The method basically, let's say if we were a country, we would have to decide what are the dimensions of our poverty. And let's just say that we said it was education, income, and health, just to make it simple. Then we'd have to say, what is the cutoff of poverty in education, in health, and in income? Is it illiteracy? Is it the level of education? And then we'd just have to decide that as a collective group or as a country. And then we'd have to, once we had that set of 3 cutoffs, we then have to decide, to be poor in this country, do you have to be poor in all of them or just 1? Or 2? That's another decision that has to be made. And then you can get a head count of people who are poor based on that multidimensional measure. And then if you multiply that times the number of times people are deprived, the depth of their poverty, you get an index. You get a multidimensional poverty index. It's simple. It's a very simple, rigorous, academically rigorous method, which, by the way, is now being implemented because it is something that fills the need in Latin America as well as elsewhere. First, it came out in Mexico, actually. In 2009, the Mexican government used part of this methodology to create its multidimensional poverty measure, which it now uses as its poverty measure in that country. First country in the world to do that. It was picked up last year by the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Report, and you may have heard about it, but last year there was something called the Multidimensional Poverty Index that came out as part of the UN report, which ranked 104 countries, as was just seen, but based on their multidimensional measure. And what was it based on? It was based on data that exists. In other words, you have to go and find what data actually exists, which is cross-country, and that can sometimes limit the indicators that you have, especially if you're trying to do 104 countries. More importantly, it's also been used not just in Mexico, but last month it was inaugurated in Colombia by the president of Colombia, who inaugurated a multidimensional poverty index for Colombia. And so Mexico and Colombia now have the first countries in the world to have a multidimensional poverty index. This same methodology, by the way, is being used by Bhutan to develop the Gross National Happiness Index in Bhutan, and is being used by other organizations to develop other kinds of indices. But we're going to focus just on Latin America. And I would just mention, for example, that El Salvador, Chile have been working on a measure and thinking about incorporating a new multidimensional measure. We've been having discussions in Venezuela about the same thing. I just might add, by the way, that my whole life I've been working on poverty. I had a very direct pleasure of being the executive director of Acción International at one point, which is a microcredit organization that started in Latin America and now works worldwide. I also had the pleasure of then helping to set up something called Women's World Banking, which is another banking organization working on microcredit. And then I had the pleasure of being the head of Oxfam America for 11 years. And I've worked with poverty at the grassroots. And I have seen that we can do things at the grassroots that are absolutely essential. I've also seen that policies at the national level can undercut the work that we do at the grassroots. So you have to work at the grassroots level, but you have to have policies at the national level that can actually deal with the issue of poverty in a systemic and systematic way. And that's why, for me, it's exciting to move now from the grassroots to this more systemic level that we're working in with Oxford. Let me just turn on the slide projector for a second, because it might be just interesting for you to see what Mexico and Colombia have done, just very briefly, because on what their dimensions have been. So we'll put that on, and they put it on there, they said, and it's under hammock presentation, perhaps? I don't know. The other fellow, you know. No. I might just fill the gap by telling you that, because I mentioned the Dominican Republic. One of the things that I was going to end with, but I'll say now, is that this methodology, that's it, that this methodology can actually be used at the national level. It can also be used at the community level. I was in the Dominican Republic last month, in July actually, and had community meetings with people to try to measure their own multidimensional poverty. And it's amazing how people can come together and define their dimensions of poverty, what the cutoffs would be, and how much of those you'd have to have if you wanted to be poor. Now I need to find the little gadget. There we go. And this, I press this. Aha. The primary motivations for this are to show progress quickly, which you can do through M&E, target poor people. I think for me, the most important benefit of this for governments is it allows governments to find out who is multidimensionally poor and who is poor in what. They're poor in education, they're poor in health, so your dollars don't have to flow just into income programs. They can actually flow into health programs, social programs, etc. And to inform planning and process. In Mexico, this was adopted in 2009 by the government of Mexico. Coneval was the organization that put it together. And I will use just a few of their slides. But they basically had a social development law which was passed in Mexico, which defined the dimensions of poverty for them. It was defined by a law. This is unusual. But the dimensions of poverty for them are the ones you see there. Besides income, and they weighted income 50% and the others less so. So you had to be income poor as well as some of these other things. But I just wanted to give you a sense from them of how they built this. Basically, there were from 0 to 6 are the 6 deprivations of social rights, everything from education to health, etc. On the left-hand line is the income poverty. So basically, to be really well off, you wanted to be on the top right-hand corner. You're not socially deprived at all, and you have a lot of income. That's where you want the whole population to be eventually. Of course, that's not where it is. So, for example, let me just get, this is great, but it's slow. Yeah. So basically, these are the multidimensionally poor people, the people that show the deprivations of 0 to 6. The vulnerable people in terms of the poverty line is the line that comes across the middle. And what you want to do with your government policy is to try to focus on these people right here who are the acute poor. Because these people who are acutely poor are poor both in income, but also in the social variables or in their multidimensional poverty. So the idea is to how do you take the left quadrangle, extreme left quadrangle, and move it upwards. And what this does is it gives the Mexican government the data. I'll just okay. The advantage of the methodology, what it has done both in Mexico and in Colombia, that all of a sudden poverty has become part of a broad objectives of social programs in Mexico and in Colombia. I wish it were so, for example, in the United States. But what it does, what measurement has helped to do is to say, we need to put poverty within a broad policy objective. You can visualize the progress of social policy, not only on income, but also on the other things. And you can distinguish action areas, both economic and social policy, on social development. And what it allows you to do then is to target programs specifically on the extreme poor. Now, I want to be very clear to you that that Oxford, through its Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, is not telling the Mexican government or the Colombian government what it should put inside its measure. That is a national decision. What we are providing is a methodology in which they can then use the methods to put together their own measure. And I think that's really crucial to understand. In Colombia, the MPI in Colombia, which was just released last month, is a poverty measure proposed by the National Planning Office based on our measure, was developed as an instrument and designed for monitoring public policy. It complements the income poverty line, and that's really important to stress because there's some income. We are not trying to supplant income poverty line. The income poverty line is absolutely crucial to have also as a for a policymaker. But to have this other multidimensional index helps to complement that in a major way. And this measure was not imposed from the outside. It was actually developed by Colombians. In Mexico, it was developed through a number of meetings throughout the country. In Colombia, it was measured. It was done in a different way. So again, just to pick up on what was said by Mauricio, this measure focuses on the household unit because that is the household unit is where the data exists. That is comparable across people, across town, and across the country. And so we focus on household data, and in Latin America, household data is usually pretty good. In Colombia, they picked education, childhood, youth, work, health, housing, and public services. And these have never been part of the poverty measure in Colombia. They've always been part of the measure that each ministry has had, but they've never been integrated together into an index. It's the first time, and the first time in Latin America, actually, with Mexico to have done that. Now, why is this important? And let me just go to that. And I think it's basically important because it does a number of things. First of all, not only can you have a map of the country, which shows you where people are poor by different things, but also you can, the data is totally disaggregatable. By that I mean, you can take that data and cut it apart in many different ways. So for example, in Mexico, they now know their indigenous poverty is X on all the different indicators. You can tell in the state of Puebla, for example, you can tell what is the actual, who are poor in what dimensions, in what household, at the household level. That is a tremendous benefit for targeting social programs for the government. It also allows the government to have goals that they can set for each one of these indicators and to have them cross together so that they actually can then say the education and the health ministry have to work together because we have 15 goals to get to multidimensionally poor, And those 15 goals have to come together in the government. If the plan is accomplished in Colombia that they announced, if every ministry makes its job and spends the committed resources, the MPI will decrease to 22% in 2014. The president has created a policy committee for poverty reduction. Now that doesn't exist in most any country. But what it is this group is supposed to get together to talk about what are you doing and how are you doing on your poverty measure, on the poverty indicators that we've set for you. Are you up? Are you down? And the interesting thing from a political point of view is that once that's public, which it is, you can go to the website, you can then hold them accountable. You can then go to the government and say, hey, wait a minute, education, health has not gone up. You have not done what you promised you were going to do. And the exciting thing about the Colombian government is that they put themselves on the line with this measure to do just that. And there's a mandatory presence of the president, which gives weight to this whole thing. And then they put that all into numbers. Here's the kind, I'm not going to bore you with numbers, but here are all the kind of things you have to do to set up a national plan. And for all these levels, and you might say, well, why were these indicators chosen? And you have to answer, they were chosen for a lot of reasons. One, however, is what data exists. You can't have an indicator where there's no data to hold you accountable to. And it's all based on existing household data. Then, of course, there's a lot of discussion and internal discussion about what the different dimensions should be. So, policy considerations. Consider the kinds of policy analysis and response that this measure makes possible. It allows us to target. It allows us to disaggregate. It allows us to focus on the most acute rather than focusing on just those who are near the income line. Because when you have an income-only program, you want to where you have the most impact is to get the people who are least poor and get them over the line. In this particular situation, it actually helps your target to move the most acute people out of acute poverty. In other words, if this bottom line goes up, it has a direct impact on poverty and poverty measurement. So all these programs, education, social security, access to health, economic growth, impact poverty. And we're not arguing for one or the other or one exclusively. It is a combination of factors. And what a multidimensional poverty index allows you to do is to look at the whole thing together and see what is going up, what is going down over time. Now, the other thing is interesting is what people, what institutions and networks will use this. And unless there is that's why it's important to take the time to develop these correctly. And it took Colombia a year and a half to develop their measure. It took the Mexicans at least 2 years to develop the measure. It may take other countries a little less after we've now gone through the process a few times. But this is a highly, like any process, it involves political decision. What is going to be in the measure? What are the indicators you're going to choose? What are the cutoffs going to be? All those are difficult decisions that have to be made not by Oxford and not by some international expert, but by local people in their own country. And that, once there's buy-in on that, once it gets approved at the national level, then there's buy-in. And then the ministers get evaluated on those programs that they've set up. So for example, in Mexico, other ministries besides the Ministry of Social Development understand their better role in reducing poverty in Mexico, starting to evaluate social programs using this approach. Social programs are changing the way they identify their beneficiaries, because this allows you to say, it gives you a whole different picture of who's poor. Because not only it includes people who are income poor, but it includes people who don't have education, it includes people who don't have health, people who might have income but are deprived in everything else, all of a sudden become poor. And by helping to lift them out of poverty in those social indicators, one can have a major impact. Also, with an income line, one tends to focus on cash transfers. Nothing wrong with cash transfers, but that's not a solution to poverty. It is one tool in an arsenal of poverty reduction, and which has to include education and health and access. And we too come out of the Amartya Sen basic approach, the idea being that it is essential to build people's ultimate capabilities to be in charge of their own lives. But to be able to build people's capabilities, they have to have a certain amount of things that are there for them to go from. Basic education, basic health. If not, it's very difficult to build your capabilities and to have the capabilities that you need to flourish in this life. We too are trying through a very academically rigorous. I'm not an economist. I'm not the one who's academically rigorous, but the people that I work with are. And this is a methodology which is being tested and has been tested by economists and people throughout the world and is now being implemented. So I would end, I think, by just saying that, as I started, I have, and Andrew and I have been around the horn a number of times, quite literally actually, but also around the block a couple of times, working in poverty issues. There is absolutely nothing wrong with giving relief to people. That's absolutely essential. There is absolutely nothing wrong with working with people at the grassroots, one-on-one, helping them to develop themselves. That's absolutely essential, and groups like Oxfam and others do it all the time. And I've had the privilege, and Andrew's had the privilege of doing that for a number of years. That's essential. But it's also important to give policymakers the tools that they can actually make policies that will implement, that they can implement then policies which will impact poverty. And unless we give them those tools, and it wasn't possible to do perhaps in the past because we didn't have the methodologies, we didn't have the capacity to do it, but there is this tool. And there are others that are coming up. But I would, in terms of what Mauricio and I are talking about, it seems to me that I wish that there were agreement in Latin America on the left-hand side of your chart. I wish Latin American governments were implementing policy, measures that included all those social dimensions, so that then we could start dealing with other dimensions of poverty, which might be political, might be things like shame and humiliation, empowerment and stuff, which we're also trying to work on. But I would end by saying that it's really important to complement the work that one does in the field with the work that one does day to day, and the people who are out there on the front lines, trying to make change, trying to bring humanitarian assistance and development assistance to people, with work that is going to try to change these policies and rigorous research that allows not just to stay in the academia, because that research that stays in the academia is great, but if it goes out and tries to then do what this Oxford research has done, which is to go out and change government policies. And I'm really excited to see that Latin America is on the forefront of this. We have just in the process of signing an agreement with CEPAL, with ECLAC, to try to train people throughout Latin America in this measure, so that in fact Latin American countries throughout the region will adopt this measure, regardless of their political stripe, because the measure is a methodology. You put into it what your politics want, what the variables are that you want to have measured. And so I would end by saying that it's an exciting time. And if any of you are the young folks in the audience who are interested in new things that you want to look into research and work on, it's an exciting area. A new kind of economics, an economics that focuses not just on the traditional GDP income areas, but also focuses on a broader, inclusive economics, which includes the more social variables. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I thought the report was fascinating, and I want to sort of take off from where you ended the report. I teach a course at Georgetown in development theory and practice, and we look at the beginning of the course at what I call the 8 schools of development theory that explain why some countries are rich and some countries are poor. They're very controversial. There is the economic determinist, the geographic determinist school of Jeffrey Sachs and Jared Diamond, who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel, who argue that physical location has a lot to do with whether countries are developed or not. Larry Harrison, I sit on his board, I'm a little biased, he's very controversial, but there's actually a growing acceptance of some of Larry's research. He's a retired aide foreign service officer. He wrote a book, Underdevelopment is a State of Mind. He published it in the late 80s at Harvard, and then wrote a collection of essays by other scholars called Culture Matters. And he looks at why Chile is doing so well and Argentina right next door is not. Why Haiti is been a failed state for so long, and why the Dominican Republic is doing pretty well. Why Nicaragua is a wreck. And Costa Rica is a model middle-class democracy in many respects, with strong institutions and good distribution of income and modest levels of poverty comparatively. And he answers that values and culture. Now, it's very controversial because it gets into how different religious traditions affect development. But that's one of the theories. What I want to do is focus on three things that to me have always sort of gnawed at me. AID I was aid administrator for 5 years, but I served 20 years ago in AID running humanitarian emergency programs. But I'm interested in the broader questions of development theory now. The first is a fascinating question, and that is, why is there a better distribution of income in Asia than there is in Latin America? Much better, much better. In fact, the best distribution of income in the world is in Taiwan, interestingly enough. Nancy Birdsall gave a lecture at the World Bank at a NGO conference. I don't know why they had an economist at an NGO conference, because NGOs sometimes don't want to talk to economists. And she gave Nancy Birdsall was the chief economist of the Inter-American Development Bank, then was an economist at the World Bank, and now is the head of one of the leading think tanks in development in the United States, the Center for Global Development down the street here in Mass Ave. She said something which is fascinating. She said, if you look at poverty, poverty has a lot to do with the urban-rural divide. There are far more poor people proportionally in rural areas than there are in urban areas, even in the slums. People are much better off in urban areas all over the world. So what's the difference? Why is there in Latin America such poor indicators? This was 1983 now, 1993. This was 17, 18 years ago. It's very interesting. She argued that the threat of communist Chinese expansionism, Mao's expansionism, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s threatened the elites in South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand sufficiently that the elites actually established a much more equitable investment in rural areas as they did in urban areas. For example, in 1993, in Brazil, 90% of the people in urban areas had electricity, and 10% of the people in rural areas had electricity. In Thailand, at the same time, 60% of the people in the cities had electricity, and 40% of the people in the rural areas had electricity. The same statistics are even actually more pronounced for South Korea and Taiwan. Taiwan, as people would argue, Chiang Kai-shek was defeated by Mao. He withdrew to Taiwan. He was an autocrat at the beginning, but probably the most robust democracy in Asia right now is Taiwan, which upsets the mainland Chinese a little bit because of the robust comparisons. What did they do? They made massive investments in rural areas because Mao's revolution in China was a rural revolution. It was not a proletariat like Lenin's revolution was in Russia. And so to avoid having a rural revolution in Taiwan, they ensured huge investments in infrastructure. I mean, if you look at what Nancy did was she looked at water, sanitation, schools, electricities, and roads. And she showed that in all of these Asian countries with better distribution of wealth, it was directly related to the investment in rural areas. Very interesting. So the first argument I would make is Latin America never had a threat to its survival of the same kind that the elites feared in Asia. Now, it's very interesting. People ask me, I've been very focused. I just finished writing a book on Sudan that'll come out. Oxford University Press is publishing it in the What Everyone Needs to Know series. And I looked at this issue in the context of Southern Sudan. I just went to the Southern Sudan Independence Day, where Southern Sudan is now the Republic of South Sudan for the first time. It's an independent state. And people look at me and say it's a failed state. That's what the UN says. It drives me crazy when the UN and the World Bank says these things. Then the NGOs are just as bad. There is only one African state where there is an existential threat to the survival of the elites and the state that is permanent, that from the time of independence. Only one state, and that's South Sudan. The rest of the African states, once the revolutions took place throughout the colonial powers, they took control. There really wasn't a threat. Sometimes there were civil wars going on and revolutions, but not an external threat of some overwhelming force. If you talk to any Southerner, whether they're literate or illiterate, they have a PhD or they're a cow herder, the threat is the North. is Islamism and forced Arabism being enforced on southern Sudan. That's the reason that 98.6% of the Southerners voted for independence, despite tribal rivalries, which are very intense in southern Sudan. They want to be rid of the North, and they will tell you over and over again our principal threat in the future, not just, they don't say the threat ended with independence. They say, we now have to make this work. And so every Southerner I talk to in the government wants all their resources pushed out into the rural areas because they're afraid if they don't do that, they will lose control in the rural area. And the North will destabilize stuff, which it's already trying to do. So that's the first thing, rural-urban divide. The second issue for me is something that isn't discussed a lot. It's interesting. We had a discussion at a National Security Council meeting when I was administrator. Condi Rice was there, President was there. And this was Colin Powell was Secretary of State, Condi was a National Security Advisor. So it was about 2004. And I brought up the issue in Latin America of race as the principal issue that divides populations. Now, there is a USIP study that looked at Brazil and Bolivia. These are economists who did it. And they said that, the inequality in Latin America and poverty indexes are not related to ethnicity, but that there is inequality within groups. I haven't read the whole study. I dispute that. The AID staff in Latin America said if you just take the Amerindian, in other words, the southern indigenous Indian population, and you take their indicators of poverty, they are massively different than the pure white population, and the mestizo, or the mixed blood people of Latin America, are somewhere in between. I looked up just online, and this is not scientifically done, the pure Indian populations, if I can use that word, in these countries in the index, 2, 4, 6, 8. Now, for some odd reason, I don't think it's odd at all, Venezuela lists the ethnic groups but does not mention percentages. Now, when I brought this up at the NSC meeting, it was very interesting. Condi Rice said to me, Andrew, President Lula has brought up to me and to Colin Powell the race issue, saying Latin America has a massive race problem that no one wants to talk about or deal with. And the two Americans that probably could deal with it are Condi Rice and Colin Powell. Anybody else in the United States would be ridiculed. And we talked about whether it was the right time to do that. I'm not sure it was the right time, and I think it would have been inappropriate at that moment to do that as an American strategy, because I think we needed to redirect our aid programs toward what I see as a chronic elite discrimination against pure Indian populations. And let me just read these countries. Now this, I'm going to read the country because it's listed in terms of their rank, and then I'm going to tell you the percentage that is pure Indian. Chile, 3%. Brazil, 1%. Mexico, 30%. Colombia, 1%. Peru, 45%. Ecuador, 25%. And Bolivia, 55%. A little statistic about Bolivia. The AID officers do surveys. They don't publish them because some of them are so embarrassing for countries, about the attitudes of different segments of the population toward other segments of the population. And we do them all around the world, 100 different countries over the years. And the career staff told me the worst data in the entire world for the view of the white population of the country toward an indigenous population is in Bolivia. This was done 10 years ago. I don't know what it is now. Morales is now the president. Maybe it's even gotten more intense. The elites in Bolivia have a subhuman view, or their view of the Hamara-speaking and Quechuan-speaking Indian population, 55% of the people, is that they are not really human beings. They're below human beings. The discrimination against African Americans in the United States was the Tea Party compared to the data in these surveys. Now, is it surprising under these circumstances, since the white population has run the country since independence until Morales took over? It has not been mestizos that have run it, it is pure whites. And they make up 15% of the population in Bolivia. Now, it is not an accident that Fidel Castro sent Che Guevara to, of all Latin American countries, where did he send him? Bolivia, to try to start a revolution. Now, what the whites did in Bolivia is play the Hamara against the Quechuan speak. They didn't like each other. So the way they maintain power is to posit the two or try to play off the two against each other, and that's how they maintain power until recently. If you look at the child mortality rates, access to clean water, if you look at literacy rates in Latin America, and you look at these indigenous figures, there is a relationship. There are two Perus. There's Lima, and then there's the Quechuan-speaking people of the ancient Inca population that are pure Indian. They are in a different world. They have data similar to the poorest countries in Africa. Okay? So, now, John is taking a somewhat technocratic approach, which I respect. I love Western scholars doing these things, but I have to say something. If my argument here on race is true, and I think it is, if there is a bias in elites anywhere in the world, and you don't deal with the bias, then all of this planning, frankly, is not going to reach fruition. Now, I am on the right. I'm a conservative, even though I may sound like a Marxist today. I'm just going by the data. I'm not arguing bad or good. I'm just, the data is what we see. And the reality is that the countries with very high Indian populations have levels with the exception of Mexico. That's the exception in this list. If you look at the larger list, there is a pattern here. Now, a little side note here. If you apply the Larry Harrison theory of culture matters, I don't know if you know this. I did not know this. Do you know which subcategory of Spaniards founded Chile? It's not Spaniards generally. It's Basques. Now, the question is there any difference between the Basques of Spain and the general Spanish population? Now, I asked a friend of mine, who's a former foreign minister, and she said, I didn't know she was a Basque, she said, of course there's a difference. We're entrepreneurial, and the rest of the Spaniards aren't. We run all the businesses. Now, she is a little biased, because she's a Basque herself, but she's from the elite. She's a very distinguished lawyer in Spain. The argument that is made that the Basques have a different value system, worldview, and culture than the rest of the Spanish population, that was somewhat immune to the corruption that the movement of metals from Latin America to Spain, that had heavy corruption of the political system in Spain for centuries. We'll put that aside. But it's an interesting theory. It's worth looking at. The last point is, which I like particularly about your analysis, and that is the focus on institutions. If you look at most of the great literature now being written on what distinguishes poor countries from rich countries, it's the level and the sophistication, the robustness, the density, the legitimacy, and the sustainability of institutions. The United States has the greatest density of institutions in the history of the world for any country. And that's from a book that was done by, he didn't compare the rest of the world, but I looked at some data. It's very, very interesting. The number of, and when I say institutions, I mean government institutions. You know, we have 57,000 governments in the United States. People think of the federal government, that's only one. But most of the American government is not run in Washington, thank heaven for the country in my view. It's run at the state level, particularly at the county and local level. That's where 90% of the spending on education is at the local level for education. And for sewers and water and police and roads and all that. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all the data to show you the reason we don't have not a revolution in the United States on the streets. We don't have what has plagued many countries in this kind of an economic downturn is the strength of the institutions of the country. They're absolutely remarkable, actually. The resiliency of American institutions is what is protecting the country. This chart shows that the countries doing the best have the strongest institutions. Chile and Costa Rica and Barbados are the three countries in Latin America with the strongest institutions. And if you look at the countries that are poorest with the greatest disparity of wealth, it is the countries with the weakest institutions. Now, the big issue in the development community is, among theorists, which comes first? Do prosperous countries build strong institutions, or do the institutions get formed? And I could give a 2-hour lecture. I've been actually looking at the early American Republic to see what the answer to that question is. But Douglas North has written a book I would urge everyone to look at. It's highly theoretical. Some people think it's not applicable. I think it's very applicable to development theory today. It's called Violence and Social Orders. He did it with Barry Weingast. Douglas North won the Nobel Prize for Economics. That doesn't mean a lot to me, but in this case he deserved it, in my view, along with Amartya Sen. Douglas North argues in this that what distinguishes these countries is whether they have open access orders with strong institutions or closed access orders. In other words, patrimonial systems. What distinguish the countries in Latin America that are doing the worst they are basically patrimonial system. What is a patrimonial system? It is where the logic of the society is not based on the merit system or the rule of law or a functioning judicial system. It is based on political bosses. That is a discriminatory term, political bosses. Let's just say powerful political figures who cement relationships between their followers and themselves by giving out patronage jobs, by giving them favors through the tax system, and the most developed patrimonial system was developed by Juan Perón in Argentina, and it is the basis of the entire Argentine political system, which is why Argentina, which had the same level of wealth in 1940 as Canada, now is not the same level of wealth as Canada. Why is that? Because Juan Perón built a political machine based on political favors. If you have a civil service system that hires teachers based on not their level of competence or whether or not they perform, but based on whether they're loyal to a political boss, you think they're going to go to work every day? A problem we have all over the developing world is a thing called ghost schools. I first heard this in AID. I said to the staff, what is a ghost school? There's paid teachers. There are 50,000 paid teachers in Afghanistan. There are school buildings. There are textbooks in the school. No one's in school. I said, well, what do you mean? The teachers get their salary? Yes, but they never report to school because they got their job not based on merit, but based on political connections. And their loyalty, the reason they keep their job is not because of merit or hard work or anything else. It's because they owe their job to a particular political boss who then will go back to this person to do certain things in their political organization. Karzai is not the head of state. There is no state, per se, in Afghanistan. He is a chief among chieftains. That's what he is. And he keeps the country together. Many developing countries are kept together through alliances of these chieftains. And if they run the education system, and you think the teachers are going to go to school? You know, all over Africa, you can go to school. There's no one in the schools. Why? Because of ghost schools. Why? Patrimonialism. Weak institutions or strong institutions. Strong institutions means development. Weak institutions means the patrimonial system runs the political system. Brazil is moving away from the old patrimonial system. So is Colombia. Chile, Costa Rica, and Barbados moved away a long time ago. They're headed in the direction of an open access order if you use the theories of Douglas North. Anyway, that's my observations to explain why the data looks as it is. And some people might say that I have my biases, and I probably do.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for a very stimulating presentation. We're going to open now a period of questions and answers, comments. I would appreciate those who are asking questions to identify themselves, and a microphone will be supplied where you can give us name and affiliation. The gentleman.
Yeah. Okay. My name is Miguel Schloss. I'm from Surinvest of Santiago, Chile. I just wanted to make one comment, and it is a note of caution, without contradicting anything of what you said, which is, of course, extremely valuable. I was executive director of Transparency International in its formative years, so I have seen how some of these numbers are put together, and I've seen it in the guts and have been in the heat of discussions of how they are put together and how reliable they are. All I want to say is that one needs to take all these figures with tremendous caution. They are tremendous variations of perceptions around them, and it gives a wrong sense of precision when you put countries as number 1, number 2, number 3. You really ought to show the variance around these numbers, number 1. And when you track progress, likewise, you need to have a technical approach on what is or isn't progress and how much is there. Secondly, you also ought to be careful in having numbers that sort of relate with each other. You build up an index on poverty which has institutions in it. You shouldn't wonder that when institutions are weak, poverty looks big. It's because the way you constructed the index, no? So it's extremely important to be cautious on what this says and doesn't say, and more important, that rather than coming up with pellucid numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, try to look at the variance, try to put the countries in categories, and then you probably are starting to get closer to the reality, which tends to be messy, no? And that doesn't help the academic world, no. But that's part of the reality. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that's what we should do. We have to take those issues into consideration. Let me remind that this is the first edition of the Ethos Poverty Index. So actually what we want to do in the future, once we have some other editions, is to compare the results. I think in that way we would have some other kind of comparison in order to evaluate progress or not in every country. But I totally agree with you. I think you have to use this data with caution and taking it just as a guide to see how countries are doing comparing with each other. But once again, I think that having a line of time of different editions with this methodology will be very helpful in order to determine whether or not these countries are doing better.
Well, I would just add that I think it's really important to look at the country-specific issues, because I think country-specific is a lot more possible to do than international comparison. I mean, we've done some international comparison, and you're so limited by the data, and the data is pretty weak. But what gives you the best data, you can use the best data available in the country and use it every year. It should somehow show some change in theory. But I think you're right. I think it's especially some countries have much better data than others. There's no doubt about that.
Professor?
No. I know data on unemployment rates and things like that we used for the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. I would always get nervous when we do it because I knew how this stuff was collected, and this field staff would say, Andrew, you're not going to actually decide based on these numbers from the World Bank or Transparency International, because I know how they're constructed too. We were our biggest donor. The biggest donor of IT, I think from its founding, was AID, but I also know how the data. You would see countries like Kenya move massively from year to year, not because there is a change in the level of corruption, but because they found a way of manipulating the data.
Yeah, I just want to add to that also a good example of how many doubts you can have regarding the reliability of data is unemployment rate. In our index, as I told you, we saw that Bolivia has one of the lowest unemployment rates, whereas Chile has one of the highest. Then you have to think really how much reliable is that data. If it really is true that Chile has one of the highest unemployment rates and Bolivia the lowest. But anyway, you have to use that data. You have to use official data. There's no other way to go. So I totally agree with the fact that you have to be very cautious about it.
Was there any looking at Bolivia's numbers to see what the government says, people that are employed, what are they doing?
Well, I mean, there's a huge difference in the methodology to measure unemployment everywhere. But there's no other way to do it than actually using that data. I mean, that's the data that there is. And we were really cautious to say that in our document. I mean, to state that we were using official data and that we are relying on what they are saying, although we are aware of the fact that not always they are using the same methodology.
And the way unemployment is defined, often the whole categories of people aren't included at all, just they're not part of the system. They're just excluded from the system.
because they're not technically unemployed, they're not looking for work.
And
So-
yes, and unemployment is it's very tricky to measure because some countries only measure urban unemployment, not national unemployment. So it's a very difficult variable to measure.
Dr. Bailey?
Thank you, Norman Bailey. I'm president of the Institute for Global Economic Growth. I would like to question the data. First of all, the unemployment data is quite meaningless in much of the world, including the United States. I would like to question some of the indigenous figures that were given by Mr. Natsios. I was economic advisor to the indigenous movements of Ecuador in terms of economic development and so on and so forth. It makes a big difference if you ask the indigenous how many indigenous there are, and if you ask the other people how many indigenous there are. You gave the figure of 25% for Ecuador. The figure that's given by the indigenous people in Ecuador is about 10%.
The data I got, I have to say, I didn't, I'm embarrassed to tell you, I did not spend a lot of time preparing this. I got this, I don't even know where this comes from, off the internet. It may be completely inaccurate, but there is some comparative truth to this. In terms, if you know Latin America, everybody knows in South America, the two countries with the largest indigenous populations are Peru and Bolivia. There's general agreement on that, and Bolivia does have the highest. I actually saw statistics higher than 55% for the Aymara and Quechuan speaking. This is a very conservative figure. So I think, but there is a way to get that data. I was simply suggesting that we need to look at these issues, okay? That race in Latin America, people attack us all the time. We dealt with our race issue. Some people think completely inadequately in some respects. The fact is we have an African-American president. Our system went through convulsions for 30 or 40 years. They have not done that in Latin America in many of these countries. And as a result, they have, Chavez, by the way, I didn't say this, Chavez uses the race issue in his speeches all the time. They never get translated into English. He uses the race issue because he's part Indian. And he talks about that. And he appeals to people on that basis in other countries. That's the point I was making. The data is, you're right.
Please.
First, let me congratulate the panel for having come up with some very creative and
Your
innovative.
Name and affiliation, please.
The name is William Visser, ex-CEPAL, ex-UNDP, and now currently teaching Latin American history. I find the data, the statistics, and the categories that you have designed very creative and innovative, but quite static historically. They don't look at how things evolve over time. It's interesting because they're saying a lot, but nothing is static. For instance, in Latin America, we fortunately have a wonderful record of seeing how two entirely different political schools of thought have applied and dealt with these problems, the ISI region, 1950 to 1980, and then the neoliberal region, the period from 1980 to 2005 or so. And they give us very different impressions. Applying the same data over time, it might lead the first school of thought to say, hey, it worked nicely. And the second school of thought, hey, it worked much better than the first. So you never really can get your hands on what works. But there is enough historical data to be able to tell you what does. My problem with these statistics is it doesn't really evaluate over time. Because it's wonderful to hear that these statistics exist, but who has had the experience of applying them, and what does it tell us as a result? Thank you.
You want to give I mean, absolutely. I mean, if you just take a snapshot this year, it's interesting, but it doesn't going to tell you very much. The only way that multidimensional indexes, for example, are going to show that they're at all interesting or useful is to take them every year. And then you might be able to see next year that your education levels went up and your health levels went down. You see the correlate. You might see a correlation starting to develop between some indicators going up and some not. But I think it's really over time. Now, that implies that they're going to keep the measure the same for a number of years to see it, the variables change over time. And I think the exciting thing about this is this will not give you causal, this does not tell you the cause of why things are going up and down, but it will tell you how the things are interrelated and how these variables come together. So I think the important thing is what you said. I mean, the important thing is data exists, but exists over time, and it may not be very good data, as we were saying earlier, but if it's the same sources of data, it gives you some change over time. It's the only way it happens. I mean, the only way this is interesting is if you actually, the only way the government of Colombia is going to say this worked or didn't work is 3 or 4 years from now, not right now. I mean, if in fact they do the study every year.
Thank you. Gonzalo Palacios, former diplomat from Venezuela for a whole lot of years here in DC. And I just have one question. If your methodology and programs of determining the poverty factors and so forth are successful, and there is a reduction in the poverty levels of the countries that you mentioned and more, do you contemplate that as a beginning of changing the culture of those countries? Because I think the culture has to be changed in order to have a successful plan of reduction of poverty. You don't change the culture that Andrew was talking about, and that's it. You just postpone the poverty for another 200 years or 100 years or whatever. Thank you.
Sarah?
John Zemko with the Center for International Private Enterprise. Following on what the gentleman behind me just said, I thought it was kind of interesting that about the dynamism versus the static qualities of these sorts of studies. I mean, CEPAL just came out with a report not that long ago that said, among other things, that Venezuela had one of the best records on poverty alleviation in the region. So I wonder how those sorts of reports jibe. That would seem to be completely in conflict with the Ethos Foundation's markers. So how do you reconcile those sorts of things?
Yeah. Well, we don't disagree with any of the ECLAC reports, even though the report that you were talking about actually used data from a few years ago in the case of Venezuela and other countries. But we don't disagree with the way those measurements were carried out. We are just trying to put up a different vision to understand and measure poverty. So it's not in conflict with that one from ECLAC or any other organization. It's just a new way to measure poverty in order to enrich the debate and to come up with a different perspective to measure poverty from a much broader and comprehensive way than in the past.
Can I say something? I think that I would like to just say something about culture too, just because not to. One of the things that I think is possible, I'm not going to get into whether it changes culture or not, but if the president of Colombia decides and it's followed up not just in this administration but then over time by another administration to actually make poverty a central piece and a central part of the agenda of Colombia's political system, then over time that does start to have an impact on politics and an impact on the society in general. Because by lifting it up, let us say, to being, now whether it changes the culture as such, I'm not sure it does at all. I'm not sure. But it does lift the issue of poverty, make it central to the government and make it central to what is going on. And eventually over time it becomes that this is something we have to deal with. So I think that is really important. And then I would say one other thing. I think that one of the things that happened in Mexico, by the way, with indigenous people, is that when you have a measure that includes a lot of different indicators like education and health, and not just income, all of a sudden people who were excluded from income they weren't part of the income measure at all because they never had an income. They weren't even part of the statistics. They were just excluded. All of a sudden they are part of the statistics. So all of a sudden poverty in Mexico went up because the indigenous poverty went up, because all of a sudden indigenous people were part of the measure. So I mean, it's interesting how sometimes measures, the way they're developed, can exclude people. by having limited things that people aren't a part of. I mean, I don't know if that is clear. I don't know, but at least in Mexico, it was an interesting exercise where all of a sudden, a lot more people became poor because all of a sudden indigenous poverty was seen in official statistics.
I just want to add something more to your question. Those measurements from ECLAC are mostly based on income, and in some cases education and health and some other stuff. But it includes a whole different set of variables than the ethnos poverty index, so you would expect different results. That's why they are so different. It's just a different vision.
No, there's a couple in the back.
Yeah.
My name is Arturo McFields. I am from the Embassy of Nicaragua. I have just 3 things that I want to add to this dialogue. For example, we're talking about the reduction of poverty and how to success with it, and how much some countries have developed in this area. Just one question. For example, in Peru, Alan Garcia has good grades in what many of you call growth and good economy and everything, but in the end, people reject him and reject his party and appear something like Ollanta Humala. So how is this relationship between doing good things or getting good grades in the economy, but in the end people choose Ollanta Humala? How come? And then Mr. Andrew Natsios, he talked something about the racial thing, which I consider very interesting, but not that accurate to the reality of the Latin American countries. For example, we put Brazil as a good example of development and everything good in his economy, but they have a huge black population that sometimes we don't even mention. And we say that Bolivia is pretty low in development because they have a big population of Indian. But Brazil has a huge population of black people, but people all over say they are getting good grades in the economy and they are almost a developed country. The last question, if leaders or presidents, very controversial, like sometimes like Hugo Chavez, like you said before, if they are that bad, and what there is growing more and more a left movement with diversity, of course, because they are not all the same. But why is growing this left movement in Latin America all over, spread all over?
Let me say, I was not suggesting that the reason Latin American countries are underdeveloped is because the Indians made them underdeveloped, the indigenous population. I'm saying there's the elites, the white elites that have run the countries, have discriminated against them and completely ignored them. And if you do not invest in rural areas, which is where many of the indigenous people live, then you're going to have wide disparities of poverty, wide disparities of wealth, and you're going to have high levels of poverty. So I'm not saying one caused the other. I'm saying that if you look, and it does not appear that there is a large black population also in Colombia, obviously in Haiti. And so I was looking simply to make a point, which is we need to look at the racial makeup of these countries, because if the elites have particular attitudes, it affects how investments are made in public services and in economic growth. Then the elites spend all their time maintaining control, which means monopoly control of different parts of the economies of many of these countries. The political system is used to control whole divisions or sectors of the economy to make sure that the economy is used for patrimonial purposes. No competition. People say there's capital. There isn't capitalism in a lot of Latin America. It's crony capitalism, where the people who are in power make sure they have no competition from the outside or even from inside the country. That is not capitalism. It is actually a corrupt form of mercantilism. So I want you to, if I gave the impression of saying that the racial composition is what caused the end of it, that is not what I'm saying. It is the attitude toward, it appears more toward the indigenous population than it is toward the black population that there's a problem. It may be that Brazil has developed, one, because it's so large, it has a very powerful business community, And I think, too, they have so many different ethnic groups. There are more Lebanese in Brazil than there are in Lebanon. And so they are more like the United States in many respects, and that balances off different ethnic groups, so one doesn't control everything. One group doesn't control the entire society. Unlike Bolivia, where one group that's 15% of the population has run the country basically until Morales took over.
John?
I would like to answer the question about Peru. Actually, what happened in Peru builds on our argument that the economic factors are important but not absolute to overcome poverty. And I think that explains why Humala won, or what we saw during the last election in that country. Even though Peru has been growing its economy very rapidly during the last few years, they still have huge deprivations in the social arena, particularly in the rural areas. So I think that is why we have to think as poverty as an integral, comprehensive problem that should be attacked not only through political, economic policy, of course also with economic policy, but additionally through other kind of policies regarding institutional factors, democracy, liberties, securities, etc.
Thank you. I am Silvia Pisani from La Nación in Argentina. I would like to ask two questions. First of all, one is a matter of experience. It seems to be that in the last couple of years, the data in Argentina has become a nightmare for a lot of people. So I would like to know how was your experience working with data in Argentina about growing in the country and poverty and so on. And the second is, the last news that we have is that the United States is going to vote against loans that Argentina is asking in some development organizations like the World Bank and the Inter-American Bank. They are development institutions, and now the United States is going to vote against these loans because it's the way to punish Argentina for its international behavior. So the question is, did you ever knew about this? Is the first time the United States is going to do any experience about this political behavior? And if you think that this can affect the growth in Argentina? Thank you.
Yeah, well, regarding Argentinian data, actually, we wanted to include Argentina in our analysis. But after thinking a lot about it, it was impossible because we saw very strange things regarding official Argentinian data. I mean, I think, and that's a general consensus among academics and people doing this kind of measurements, that Argentinian data is being managed very poorly during the last few years, and that's why we decided not to include that country. Hopefully we will do it next time during the next edition of the Ethos Poverty Index.
When you say managed very poorly, something like in looking I've just been second. Thank you.
You got it right. You got it right. Concerning the question that the lady from La Nación was asking, it's been internationally recognized that Argentina officially is not generating reliable data. And that has been a big problem in their dealings with international organizations and also with international banks.
The presentation today said Latin America, poverty, radicalism, or market economy, a very sharp choice. How are we going to be answering this choice? What is the answer to the question that the conference wanted to address? Is there an alternative to the two options that are widely known?
I think that I just answer that personally. I mean, I believe that the kind of measurement that we're talking about is an indication of a new approach, that development is not just about income and money, and it's not just about GDP. And that if we're going to look at development, one has to have a holistic way of looking at it, which is what we call multidimensional. And whether it includes just the kind of variables that our measure does or broader measures. But it seems to me that the thing we're not arguing against market economics. We're arguing against market economics that doesn't actually deal with the issues of poverty. And market economics left by itself has not. And so the question then becomes, how does one have an economic system based on, for example, Amartya Sen types of ideas, which includes a market economy, but also includes the human aspect. And in other words, it makes poverty eradication and makes the building of people's capabilities central. All people's capabilities, not just the elite that Andrew's talking about. All people's capabilities as the end goal, as what we want to do. Now that's not a radical shift to some extreme, but it's fairly significant shifts from what towards we've been moving. So that's how I personally, that's how I view it. And so I really do believe that we need a new kind of economics, which is basically going to focus on economics, but it's also going to have those things which were outside the economic box and were externalities have to start getting put back into it, because they are part of people's welfare. For example, the Gross National Happiness Index, sometimes people laugh at it, but in fact it's a well-being index. It's a flourishing index, which includes a lot of things that have nothing to do with happiness, but have to do with the well-being of people. And I think all societies should have some sort of well-being index, in terms of, because the ultimate aim of development is not just money, it's the well-being of people.
No, it's Costa Rica.
I don't know. Absolutely. No argument. I don't know if I answered. That was very personal.
I think you can say, because we have experience all over the world with Marxist systems. Chavez is attempting to establish a Marxist system. There is no place on earth. Amartya Sen says there's one Indian state in India that has succeeded. But I would argue that is an anomaly, one, and two, it's in a larger state that gets subsidies from this system. So I'm not sure, and it is a democracy. I think what we do know now, there's a book called The Democracy Advantage, written by a guy who used to work for me, Joe Siegel and Mort Halperin. And they look at an issue that was dealt with in the 60s by, he just died, and he was teaching, taught at Harvard, The Clash of Civilizations. Huntington famously wrote that democracy is not good for economic growth in the 60s. And we now know that's not the case. There's also a book by Steve Radlett, who's the chief economist at AID, who used to be at the Center for Global Development. He wrote a book with Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, the president of Liberia, which looks at democracy in Africa. And it shows that in Africa, the 18 democracies that have been democracies for 20 years had an average 2% growth rate each year for 20 years. The countries that were not democracies had minus growth. And so the data is now showing that democracy, I mean real democracy, with rule of law, which is most essential. You know, Milton Friedman advocated free markets as a solution to Russia and Eastern Europe's problems, and we did that, and it was successful in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. It was disaster in Russia. And at the end of it, he was asked, "You were wrong." He said, "I was wrong." He said, "I was wrong." He said, "The rule of law is more important than anything else. The rule of law, to know the rules of the game ahead of time." And the damage that Marxist systems do, or right-wing dictatorships, doesn't make any difference, is there is no rule of law. The dictator and the security services basically dictate, and people don't know what to predict, so people don't invest money. And countries that are moving to the radical left to undermine democratic institutions are going to find out there are going to be consequences, and the consequence is you're not going to have growth, and you certainly have a reduction of poverty, and there is the reason that there may have been some indicators of improvement in Venezuela is basically Chavez emptied the national treasury. They had $28 billion in that fund. If you spend it all in subsidies, that it's not renewable because it's all gone now. then you're going to have problems. I think, though, that what Lula did in Brazil is a middle way. He took a market economics, the rule of law, democratic political system. He never tried to undermine democratic institutions, and he began some social programs in education, in health, in the slums of the large cities. So I think the solution is the two things: democracy, the rule of law, strong institutions, market growth, and public sector interventions in social services that are needed to educate the public, improve health, and build infrastructure in the rural areas where a lot of the poverty is. It's not either or. Well,
No, there is a difference.
Yeah,
that's not the Washington
No,
Constitution.
no.
I think that if we look at poverty as a more comprehensive phenomenon, not going beyond only the economic factor, then you see that you need a government that would respect not only democracy but also liberties, human rights, institutions, in order for you to argue that poverty is being reduced. So for me, as I said during my conference, more than talking about a left-wing model or a right-wing model to alleviate poverty, I think the right model is what we call the responsible government model, doing the kind of things Professor just mentioned, respecting the institutions, promoting democracy. Because if being poor is not only a matter of money, but rather being unable to live long, productive, and fulfilling lives, then you need to have liberties, you need to have rights. And a radical regime, an authoritarian regime, like some of the ones that we are seeing now, unfortunately, in Latin America, they don't respect such liberties and rights. Then those countries are poor under this broader perspective of poverty. But also, not having liberties, not having rights, not having solid institutions also have a very negative effect in economic poverty, because they, by not having all these things, then you are not establishing the necessary conditions for economic growth and therefore for alleviating even economic poverty.
One final question.
Hello, I'm Francisco Abad. I am a university student and intern in the Organization of American States. I would just like to make a general question, because it was really interesting what everybody just said now about democracy and liberties. But at the same time, we see a very big movement in South America that is so-called socialism of the 21st century. And is, well, what I've seen, at least in 3 countries, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, is that through democracy, through democratic elections, through constitutional processes, liberties are being taken away. For example, in Ecuador, there's such thing as the muerte cruzada that Rafael Correa uses all the time in order to threaten the opposition whenever they don't help pass some bill that he has on his agenda. So what can we do if systems like these are arising and are using democracy? Yes, but they are taking liberties using this democracy and these constitutions that people have voted on.
Could I just make a comment about the Washington Consensus? The Washington Consensus was principally an economic approach. It was not about institution building. In fact, we didn't even talk about institutions 30 years ago. It was about macroeconomic policy, and if you really look at the stuff, even microeconomic policy, it was not about democracy. It was not about political institutions, public and private. And so it's not a fair comparison in terms of what I was arguing.
Going to Francisco's question, I think that elections are necessary for democracy, but not enough. The countries that you mentioned, yeah, they do have elections, but they don't have a whole lot of things that you need to have in order to call yourself a democracy.
It's like Saudi Arabia giving women the vote.
On that happy note, we thank you very much for having attended our conference, and let's give our fantastic team a round of applause.